join us in this webinar on national climate policy developments and corporate responses from around the world. I'm Jonathan Shopley, Managing Director at the CarbonNeutral Company here in London. My colleague, Oliver Crouch, who leads our strategic development activities, will be presenting. We're thrilled to have over 80 people from across Europe and North America signed up for today's webinar. For those who don't know the CarbonNeutral Company, we've provided climate solutions to business for over 15 years, and we are privileged to count companies including Avis, Bain & Co., Coca-Cola, Marks & Spencer's, Microsoft, and UPS amongst those who have used us to design and deliver competitive greenhouse gas reduction strategies built on internal reductions, renewable energy, and carbon offsetting. So why this webinar now? Over the past 15 years, companies have developed responses to climate change for two broad reasons. First, to comply with regulation, and second, voluntarily to future-proof their businesses, to deliver on corporate responsibility commitments, save money, or differentiate their products and services for environmentally concerned customers. In the mid-noughties, by which I mean around 2005, the UN's Kyoto Protocol provided most of the regulatory drive. However, progress on finding a successor global agreement is slow and confused. Now many governments are developing their own national policies that are changing the landscape for regulated and non-regulated corporations around the world. That is why we think this seminar is a timely one. I'm now going to hand over to Ollie to present our insights on how national climate policy is influencing corporate responses on climate. Ollie, over to you.
Jonathan, thanks for setting the scene. So the warm-up for this webinar was a report we prepared summarizing national climate policy and corporate action across 14 countries. I know some of you have already seen this report and it's available on our website. It doesn't matter if you haven't reviewed that report, because the focus of today's webinar is to take a closer look at 4 of the more interesting countries from a policy and corporate action perspective. And those countries are Brazil, the United States, China, and the United Kingdom. 2 developing and 2 developed economies. I'm going to cover 3 sections today. The first 2 align with the broader report, looking at policy highlights and corporate action. And the third section looks at how these 2 play out within the voluntary carbon market. And by that I mean the market for action beyond and ahead of compliance. Key sources for this analysis have been the Globe International and the Climate Policy Initiative on the policy side, the CDP for corporate action, an ecosystem marketplace for the carbon market analysis, along with our own insights from serving clients across 34 countries. In terms of national policy, we applied the EU's energy label scheme, scoring countries A to E to provide a snapshot of climate policy. A means strong and effective national policy, F means weak and ineffective. In terms of the mechanisms for setting policy, the UK, US and Brazil have a lawmaking system involving 2 chambers. For the US, achieving alignment between these 2 chambers on a comprehensive climate bill has proved elusive, and hence the D rating. Both the UK and Brazil have succeeded in passing these comprehensive climate bills, and both receive a C rating. Brazil and the US experienced a division of legislative power between the central and state governments, and this division can present challenges when trying to implement and introduce climate policy. In contrast, China benefits from a command and control structure. Legislative power sits with the National People's Congress, and there is no division of power between central and provincial governments. And this means once focused on an issue like climate change, as China is now, they have started to make rapid legislative progress, and hence the overall B rating. So that's the energy label approach. A second way to examine the dynamics of climate policy is to consider the stock and flow of climate change-related laws, which we do on the next slide. This chart maps the stock and flow of climate policy by considering the number of climate laws and the rate of climate law creation, which are the 2 axes you see on that chart. The picture is influenced by a number of factors. The first factor is the time when climate change became a legislative issue. Countries that engaged early with a relatively strong stock of laws and therefore a decreasing flow, and this is true of the UK, which is positioned in the top left. Countries at the height of the legislative process sit in the top right quadrant, which is where you find Brazil, which is rapidly adding new legislation to an already considerable stock. While China, having more recently engaged with climate change as a legislative issue, is located at the bottom right quadrant with an accelerating number of laws, but a low stock. The second and third factors are a country's overall approach to climate policy and the relative priority of climate change. Both factors are relevant to the US, which, having struggled to prioritize tackling climate change with a legislative approach, is now favoring a regulatory approach, looking to work through the existing authority of the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate air pollutants. The result is a low stock and slow rate of climate law creation, which places the US in the bottom left of the chart. Hopefully that gives you a couple of useful frameworks considering the dynamics of climate change legislation. We're now moving on to examine some of the key policy highlights within each of these four countries, starting with Brazil. For Brazil, the climate policy has been all about deforestation, which is why this slide is titled Protecting Forests Through Policy. The Amazon, the world's largest rainforest, lies mostly within Brazil. In the early 2000s, the conversion of forest areas and land use change accounted for over 75% of Brazil's GHG emissions. Controlling and combating deforestation has been one of Brazil's biggest climate policy success stories. Since 2005, the deforestation rate in the Brazilian Amazon has decreased 82%. And having greatly reduced large-scale deforestation, the challenge now is how to address small-scale deforestation, and measures to do this are at the heart of the National Policy on Climate Change, the Forest Code, and the innovative Green Allowance Law, which pays smallholder farmers for the ecosystem services they can deliver through more sustainable farming practices. The National REDD Plus strategy is expected to become legislation in the near future, and that will bring clarity to the types of activities eligible for REDD Plus credits and the types of REDD Plus credits eligible for trade. Beyond deforestation, Brazil is one of the world's least carbon-intensive economies, thanks to its abundance of fresh water. 45% of primary energy originates from clean energy sources. Brazil is the world's second largest producer of biofuels and the third largest producer of hydropower, and it has a commitment to expand into wind and biomass. Encouragingly, Brazil is the first developing nation to take on an absolute GHG target, aiming to limit emissions to 2 gigatons of CO2 by 2020, and that's about a 6% reduction relative to 2005 levels. With its combination of natural resource wealth and innovative policies, Brazil is well positioned to play its part in combating climate change. Next, we take a look at the US. We gave the US a D rating and placed them in the bottom left-hand box. However, as the title suggests, they are making great progress despite the policy deadlock. Over the last 7 years, energy-related carbon emissions have fallen 13%, and that's with no sign of a federal climate policy and only a modest 5% reduction target by 2020. Historically, the US has been a leader in climate policy, being the first to implement clean air and water measures in the 60s and later controlling CFCs. However, the political will has since waned and the climate debate in the US is increasingly partisan. But fortunately, a boom in shale gas has transformed the US energy landscape and with it the national emissions profile. However, the longer-term implications for emissions are less clear. Without strong congressional support for climate policy, the US government makes use of other policy levers, namely incentives, regulation, and support for innovation. Incentives for renewable energy and energy efficiency have been one of the most significant federal climate policy tools in the US. These incentives have been instrumental in doubling the level of renewable generation within the last 4 years, and at the same time, the US has been successful in supporting innovation to develop significant domestic wind manufacturing capacity. In the absence of congressional action on climate change, the federal government is now turning to the established regulatory framework of the Clean Air Act, using it to set the first GHG emission standards for cars and light trucks, and more recently setting out plans to do the same for power plants. At the state level, California continues to blaze a trail, taking comprehensive action, and with a cap-and-trade system, an ambitious renewable portfolio standard, and a long-term 2050 reduction target in line with the EU's commitment. I think the challenge for the US going forwards is how it can weave together these existing policies around energy efficiency and renewables into a national framework that reaches the necessary level of ambition. And given the current political gridlock, that's going to be a huge challenge. Next, we take a look at China. The world's success in addressing climate change will in large part be determined by China's climate policy. Between 2005 and 2010, China represented a quarter of the world's economic growth. This growth accounted for over 80% of the world's growth in oil consumption and 90% of the growth in coal consumption. Simultaneously, China is pursuing low-carbon growth at an unprecedented scale, and it's now home to over 25% of the world's installed wind generation capacity, and last year it attracted 42% of global renewable energy investments. These are mind-boggling statistics, but what's China doing on the climate policy front? Well, importantly, in the 12th Fifth-Year Plan, which sets out the national agenda for 2011 to 2015, China made climate change an explicit component of national legislation for the first time, with specific targets for reductions in energy intensity, carbon intensity, and the renewable energy share of primary energy demand. Furthermore, it set the stage for a comprehensive climate change bill, which is currently under development and anticipated for late 2013, early 2014. China's renewable energy law is aimed at diversifying China's energy mix away from coal by introducing renewable energy quotas for power generators, similar to the renewable portfolio standards that have been successful in the US. As a result, wind power installation capacity increased 40-fold in the 5 years from 2005 to 2010. And similar to the US, at the same time, China has been able to foster domestic wind manufacturing capacity to meet this demand, something the UK has failed to achieve. As a large and populous country, China relies on the local governments for a degree of policy innovation. China is currently experimenting with climate policy by encouraging 7 provinces to establish emissions trading markets, with a view to informing a national emissions trading scheme to come in by 2020. The new party leadership, which took the helm at the end of 2012, has signaled its interest in creating a low-carbon economy, putting out an ambitious call for China to create an ecological civilization. And designing and implementing the policy framework to achieve this remains one of the world's biggest climate challenges. Next, we take a look at the UK. I think it's fair to say that Europe seeks to lead the world in terms of climate policy and that the UK seeks to lead Europe. The UK has implemented numerous policy instruments, at times making policy purely for climate's sake. Nevertheless, these policies prepared the ground for the UK's flagship legislation, the 2008 Climate Change Act. This act provides a long-term framework for the transition to a low-carbon economy and sets ambitious reduction targets with 5-yearly carbon budgets to ensure a credible trajectory towards an 80% by 2050 reduction target. In 2011, the government approved the level of the 4th carbon budget, running from 2023 to 2027 at 1.9 gigatons, which you'll recall is comparable to Brazil's 2020 absolute target of 2 gigatons. An important backbone of UK climate policy is the transposition in national legislation of EU directives. Most notable is the European Emissions Trading Scheme, which regulates over 30% of UK GHG emissions. In 2012, the Green Investment Bank was formed with an initial capitalisation of £3 billion, and it will evolve to assume borrowing powers from 2016. The UK has an extensive set of energy efficiency legislation and policies aimed at promoting energy efficiency and the low-carbon energy network. This ranges from the creation of independent not-for-profit organisations like the Carbon Trust, who promote best practice, through to needlessly complicated schemes like the CRC Energy Efficiency Scheme, which has morphed into a cap and tax scheme, reaching right down the economy to domestic-level initiatives such as the Green Deal, designed to break down the barriers to domestic energy efficiency. The main challenge for the UK is going to be trying to maintain this momentum for climate change despite the ongoing financial difficulties, and at the same time continuing to push Europe to seek greater climate action internationally. So that concludes the policy highlights. The next section looks at corporate climate action to see how corporates are responding to these diverse national policy frameworks in formulating their corporate carbon management strategies. In this section, we analyze the 2012 CDP responses. For those not familiar with the CDP, it's an international not-for-profit providing a system for the world's largest companies to share environmental information. It started with carbon data and has broadened its focus to include water and to collect data on cities as well as corporates. The charts within this section examine the corporate carbon data, charting the 2011 and 2012 responses, 2011 in orange and 2012 in green. Importantly, the sample sizes differ by country, which in part is a function of how many years the CDP has been requesting data for in that particular country. In Brazil, we've looked at responses from the largest 80 companies. In the US, from the S&P 500. In China, the largest 100. And in the UK, the survey went out to the FTSE 650. All the charts show the percentage of corporates responding positively to the statement that forms the chart title. Again, 2011 data in orange, 2012 data in green. Chart 1 shows the percentage responding out of the national sample sizes, which are the numbers in brackets. And for all the following charts, they plot a percentage of this responding population. So to work an example from chart 1, in Brazil, the CDP asked for data from 80 companies, and just over 60% responded in 2012. So that's about 50 companies. Then if you look at chart 2, in 2012, almost 80% of Brazilian companies were engaging with climate policymakers. And that equates to about 40 companies, i.e. 80% of the 15 Brazilian companies that actually responded to the CDP. Sticking with chart 1, you can see for Brazil and the US, the response rates are fairly steady at just over 60%. The response rate steps up significantly in China, but note the very small sample size, which equates to only 8 companies in 2011 and 23 companies in 2012. And fear not for the UK. The drop in response rates below 60% in 2012 is largely because in 2012 the CDP extended their survey from the FTSE 350 to the FTSE 650. Chart 2 plots the percentage of companies engaging policymakers to encourage climate policy. Encouragingly, there is a positive trend in all countries, with the US holding steady, which is understandable given the policy gridlock we've seen in the US. A significant step up for China to over 40% reflects the fact that China is just beginning to get into its stride in terms of introducing climate policy. Charts 3 and 4 speak to the governance structures and incentives in place to manage climate change responsibilities. In chart 3, if we ignore China, which again is impacted by that small sample size, the other countries reported well over 80% with board-level responsibility for climate change and a positive trend 2011 to 2012. While this is positive, chart 4 shows there's considerable room for improvement in terms of introducing incentives, financial or otherwise, for the management of climate change. Moving to chart 5, we see a continuing resistance by large corporates across all 4 countries to take on absolute emission reduction targets. Interestingly, the US leads with nearly 40% of corporates setting absolute reduction targets. Much like most of the developed world, large corporates prefer to work towards intensity-based carbon targets that allow for corporate growth. And one of the key climate challenges is how corporates can decouple revenue growth from emissions growth. And as you'll see in the next section, the carbon market has an important role to play in this decoupling. Encouragingly, chart 6 shows a positive trend in large corporates actually delivering a reduction in total scope 1 and 2 emissions, albeit from a worryingly low base. Again, with US corporates demonstrating the lead here. Together, charts 5 and 6 highlight more corporates are delivering absolute reductions than are prepared to commit to an absolute reduction target. And I think this speaks to corporate concerns about the reputational risks of setting targets that are then missed. Charts 7 and 8 bring the data back to government policy, highlighting the companies identifying both risks in chart 7 and opportunities in chart 8 from climate regulation. As you would expect, corporates in the countries with more climate laws and regulations, i.e. Brazil and the UK, that sat in the bottom half of our quadrant see more risks and opportunities than the corporates in US and China that operate in economies with less climate legislation that sat in the bottom half of our quadrant. So that wraps up the corporate action analysis, and I think the key takeaway is that despite operating in very different policy environments, UK, US and Brazilian corporates are adopting broadly similar approaches to managing carbon and climate risks. And while corporates in China are clearly lagging, I fully anticipate they will close the gap fast, in the same way that China is rapidly closing the gap from a climate policy perspective. And this in large part is because most of China's largest corporates are in fact state-owned or partly state-owned enterprises. So having shared some insights on both the climate policy and corporate action front, I wanted to conclude my presentation by briefly highlighting how these two factors play out within the voluntary carbon market to illustrate the power of the carbon market as a mechanism that enables large corporates to decouple revenue growth from emissions growth. Importantly, all four countries recognize the power of carbon credits to provide corporates with access to low-cost emission reduction opportunities and therefore optimize the cost of meeting stretch reduction targets. This is evidenced by government departments within each of the four markets introducing specific carbon credit standards that are designed to address the particular needs of their country. In the UK, the Forestry Commission developed the Woodland Carbon Code designed to encourage private investment in the creation of new woodlands. The Chinese government invested in the development of the Panda Standard, designed to encourage investment into the domestic rural economy. The Climate Action Reserve is a California state initiative focused on standardizing greenhouse gas reduction project protocols and offsets relevant to the US economy. While Brazil has developed the Mata Viva, a payment for environmental services standard with a forest carbon accounting component. And again, this is designed to generate resources for the introduction of new sustainable technologies for land use and management. So you can see all four governments not only endorse carbon credits, but are actually seeking to exploit the carbon market in order to deliver other domestic climate policy goals. And this brings me on to my final slide, which I think really highlights the power of the carbon market to connect these individual markets. This chart is taken straight from the latest State of the Voluntary Carbon Market report, so credit to Molly Peters-Stanley and the guys at Ecosystem Marketplace for compiling the data. It maps the 2012 carbon credit flows, which totaled more than 100 million tons. The from circles represent supplied volumes, and the to circles represent purchased volumes across each region. And I then split out the specific volumes for the US, UK, China, and Brazil in the mini bar charts. I think what's more important than the volume is the chart's visual, which shows the carbon market providing the liquidity that allows a US, UK, Brazilian, or Chinese-based corporate to reach right around the world and fund an emission reduction project that allows them to meet an ambitious GHG reduction target in the most cost-effective way. And it's this proven ability and potential for the carbon market to connect individual economies that makes us proud to work with corporates that recognize the value of carbon offsetting. And this flow of carbon finance may well prove to be more effective in developing an internationally joined-up response to climate change than the slow and complicated process at the heart of the UN's efforts. So that concludes my presentation. I hope I've given you some useful insights across these three sections, and I'll now hand back to Jonathan for his closing remarks.
Thank you, Ollie, and thank you all for your attention today. You should already have a copy of the report that stands behind the presentation, and a recording of this webinar will be available on our website as of next week. We'd very much welcome your feedback, and we'd be happy to answer any questions and to hear from you if you'd like information about our services. Contact information is on the slide that's up on your screen now. We're closing the webinar, and again, thank you so much for attending.